All right, I've got something for you guys today that I think will be a little bit fun. Me and Justin and I, who have the Wordy Pair podcast, we recently did an episode on the Phantom of the Opera, and a couple of months ago we did an episode on Dracula. I'll put links in the description, where we kind of reviewed both books. Both of these books are, at least in sources that I've looked at, described as classics of the Gothic horror genre, but they're very different books. And so I thought it might be interesting to kind of look at how both of them handle horror and to kind of try to pull out a couple of elements of what makes horror work in these books, and see how they both treat these particular elements. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first element that I want to talk about is pacing. Generally speaking, you can have a very fast pace consistently in like an action story, right? But in general, that kind of consistent fast pace isn't really conducive to like a sense of dread or foreboding or fear. If there's action, if there's an enemy right in front of you, so to speak, then you kind of know what you have to do. But it's when things slow down, when the enemy is plotting, when you don't know where the enemy is going to come from. That's when opportunities for horror, for fear appear. Dracula does this fairly well. There's plenty of slow parts where the characters that kind of the characters that we're interested in Dracula are kind of discussing with each other what's going on, what's happening, trying to understand the phenomenon that is Dracula, because this book was written kind of at a time where, it was thought that supernatural superstitions had kind of gone by the wayside, and it was now kind of the rise of the age of science, right? And so the people in the book Dracula are trying to understand or piece together what the heck is actually going on, right? There's the moments where Van Helsing is like, well, these people are not injured, they're not hurt, they don't appear to be bleeding internally, and yet they're suffering from some kind of form of anemia, something's going on. And then he kind of pieces together gradually that this is not, just some kind of like disease, that there's an actual, actor in the form of Dracula who's taking their blood from them and causing them to suffer like this. We have fast parts in the book too, where something is on the attack. They're being attacked by wolves that Dracula has summoned. They're attacking. They're going after what's her name, who had just perished from Dracula, and she's been risen as a vampire on her own, and they're going after her. There's the chase of trying to hunt down Dracula as he tries to escape back to Romania, things like that. What generally happens is that you have these kind of slow parts where you build this dread, this foreboding, this worry that something bad's going to happen, that the bad guys are marshaling their forces in a way that's going to make it difficult for the good guys to defeat them, or or they'll be surprised, or they'll be taken unawares, things like that. And then you have those slow parts, crescendo into fast parts where the plans of action, the different things that the characters are trying to accomplish, it becomes time for action. It becomes time to hunt the vampire, to chase this group of people carrying a coffin back along the road to Romania, kind of thing. To defend themselves against the wolves and things like that. There's these kind of great differences in the pacing of Dracula that help to give you that sense of horror, and then to like accomplish or complete the sense of horror by showing just how monstrous the things that can happen are, right? Phantom of the Opera is a little bit different in this sense. Phantom of the Opera has kind of like a very bimodal distribution of how the pace goes, right? A lot of the time it's very, very slow, and then sometimes it reaches this kind of frenetic, desperate pace where things are going so fast and so crazy that it's almost kind of hard to believe. And what I think is happening here is that the author is trying to justify the madness of the Phantom himself, right? And for a certain type of madman, this would work. And there's definitely kind of like a manic depressive thing going on here, right? Where the Phantom is at some moments focused on his music that he's writing. He's focused on just kind of doing whatever it is that he does on normal. And sometimes he kind of gets whipped up into a frenzy. And that works, but at the same time, we have to recognize that the Phantom of the Opera is a character who is mad, yes, but he has generally been patient enough to work via trapdoors, by stealth, by attacking people when they least expect it, by tricking people over long periods of time into some kind of confidence. And so, on some levels, this kind of frenetic pacing almost betrays the type of madness that we've been shown the Phantom has. And in that sense, I'd say it's a little bit less appropriate than the kind of pacing that we see in Dracula. We have other cases in Phantom of the Opera where the pacing is super fast because a character is kind of like rambling or babbling. There's the moments, or there's the period where the character of the Persian is telling the other main character, keep your gun at the level of your eyes, at the level of your eyes. And he keeps repeating this over and over again to the point where it sounds like desperate or even kind of like disturbed, right? And at the same time, like, there's no reason for this to be written in such a frenetic way, because later on in the story he does explain why he's saying put your hand up by your eye, and it's not to shoot the guy when he appears, but it's to protect himself from being strangled, basically. There's the two keys scene where the Phantom is basically telling the woman, pick one of these keys and turn it, and you will determine what happens to the opera. And he keeps rambling and babbling, and it's one of those manic moments, but at the same time, it's not very horrifying. It's tense, but it's not like there's no dread there. It's like, well, he's clearly off his rocker at this point and is having some kind of an episode. So what's going to happen is going to happen, and the characters are going to do what they can to stop him, but what can they do, right? High tension is fine, but the problem with maintaining a high tension, a rapid pace for a very long time is that the reader can kind of become inured to it. And that's why you need to that's why I think that Dracula, in slowing down and then speeding up, and then slowing down and then speeding up, kind of does a better job of using pacing to elicit that sense of horror, whereas the Phantom of the Opera tends to get a little bit too crazy for a little bit too long, and then slows down to a point where like nothing seems to be happening sometimes. I don't know. I'd say pace-wise, Phantom of the Opera is kind of the inferior example of how to do horror via pacing compared to Dracula. But anyway, let's move on to number 2. Demonstration is what I'm calling it. And what it basically is the object of horror showing what it can do. And here, I think both of these books excel in very significant ways. For instance, Dracula demonstrates his powers at several points in the story, from the beginning to the very end. He has powers of persuasion. He has powers to turn into mist, to control wolves. He has the power to kill people in such a way that they themselves rise from the dead in order to, prey upon others. He has control over other, vampires, like the women in his castle. He's knowledgeable. He's intelligent. He's manipulative, right? Dracula is very good at demonstrating his powers at various points in the story, and not all of his powers are as flamboyant as the others, right? The couple of chapters near the beginning where he's merely talking to what's his name, talking to the main character, and just kind of like, oh, well, how would I go about purchasing real estate in England, kind of thing. It's very subtle, and there's points where he almost seems human, right? Where he seems to just merely be curious or interested about knowledge in a particular area, and not because he's got some kind of ulterior motive necessarily. I mean, we find out later that there were ulterior motives, but in general, the story does a good job of making him seem benign at first, at least relatively so. Assuming you've never heard of the story before. I mean, everybody knows that Dracula's the bad guy, but right, if you erase that knowledge from your mind, the first couple of chapters aren't really that terrifying. Dracula doesn't really seem that terrifying, but in fact, he seems intelligent and even cultured to a point. Now, Phantom of the Opera is one of those books that has a lot of really good ideas for demonstrations, right? Like we have, a main antagonist who has two specialties. Number one, trapdoors. He's capable over time of building a series of hidden passages and trapdoors in any structure that allow him to kind of appear and disappear at will, to put out his voice from different places. He's a master ventriloquist. He's capable of making his voice appear from someone else, which is a really great deceptive skill for an antagonist to have, right? You can confuse the protagonists. You can convince them that the enemy is over here when it's actually over here. We also have his more belligerent ability as a master of the lasso, right? He can basically make a loop of string and throw it at someone and strangle them, easily, which is why they have to kind of defend themselves by keeping their hands up near their face so that any loop, gets their hand in there too so that they can get themselves out. I mean, the lasso master thing is a really fun idea for a villain, right? Because you could use it in a lot of different ways. You could have, a couple of main characters traversing a dark corridor, and one of them vanishes, because he gets strangled, or even, to make it a little bit less cliche, he's holding his hand up and he gets grabbed, and the other characters have to rush to his aid, which gives the Phantom the opportunity to do something else, right? To have some misdirection or something like that. Now, unfortunately, the character of the Persian in the Phantom of the Opera kind of ruins all of this mystery. That's another element of Dracula, is that you don't quite know exactly what his powers are. You see him do one thing, then you see him do something else, and these things are kind of not generic, but generalized enough that you're like, okay, well, he could probably do this too, and he could probably do this too. Whereas the Persian kind of, and there's a certain amount of supernaturalness to Dracula, of course. But, what we have is, and supernatural maybe isn't the right word, maybe mystery is the right word, because it's mysterious about what his abilities are. Whereas with the Phantom, the Persian just says, oh yeah, he does this and he does this and he does this. Whereas if the story had been written in such a way where these abilities were demonstrated in a more pointed way, as opposed to just being told to us, right? The Persian character tells us, oh yeah, he had this one castle and he just built, trapdoors all over the place, and they had to basically arrest him, and they almost executed him. Oh, and he was really good at strangling people for whatever reason. He really liked doing that. It's kind of it's villainous, but it's not necessarily horrifying. I mean, there's a reason why trapdoors are frowned upon in mystery, for instance, right? Because it kind of gives the antagonist the ability to do things that the reader has no way of kind of like predicting, right? And this could be done in a variety of ways. The trapdoors are typically used for him to move himself around, but trapdoors can be used in a variety of other ways, right? To pull other people into dangerous situations. And we see a little of that, but not too much of it in the book, honestly. And there's other cool ideas in Phantom of the Opera. Like there's the Mirror Desert. It's basically a small hexagonal room with temperature control and basically an iron tree standing in the middle of it. And the walls, the inside walls of this hexagon are mirrored so that it kind of produces the illusion of a vast, unending desert of iron trees. And so, the characters can get locked in there and they can be tortured by increasing the temperature to cause it to feel like a desert. They go mad from thirst and heat stroke kind of thing. And that's super interesting. And that part of the book is really, really one of my favorite parts of the book, honestly, because it was like such a cool idea and it was executed so well. Whereas the trapdoor stuff always was like, oh, it comes out of nowhere. I mean, it's quite literally, it's very analogous to, I won't say quite literally, but it's very analogous to a simple deus ex machina. Now, the trapdoor is a way by which the Phantom can appear from nowhere. A phantom from a machine, perhaps. And so, again, Dracula kind of does a really good job of demonstrating Dracula's powers, but leaving enough mystery so that the reader is unsure how any particular encounter is going to proceed. Whereas the Phantom has a lot of really great ideas. Master of trapdoors, master of the lasso, master of ventriloquism, mirror desert, strange torture devices, stuff like that. But unfortunately, in the way that book is written, a lot of that mystery is ruined by the character of the Persian, who just is like, yeah, it's this. And it's not like that happens right at the end of the book. It happens in the middle of the book, or like the late middle of the book, where the action's actually started to ramp up, and the Persian just like, no, there's nothing special here. It's just this. And it's like, it's very I found it very jarring. Anyway, let's move on to number 3, distance. Now, this is something that I think Justin crystallized very well in one of our episodes. I think it was the one about aliens, where hand-to-hand combat is scarier than ranged combat because the danger is closer to you, right? And you have to let the danger get closer to you in order to actually fight it. That's the other thing, right? If you could always just run away, but if your goal is to confront something, some antagonistic force, then being able to do it from further away is better than having to do it from close in. Now, both of these books play with the notion of distance in very interesting ways. For instance, Dracula as a character makes plans. He has he makes his plans in Romania. He is planning to move himself and some of his minions to England because it's greener pastures, basically, right? He comes up with the plan of moving Arthur, wasn't it Arthur something? To Romania and holding him there so that he gets information from him and then basically, kills him off and gets to England without anyone knowing how he got there, but himself having a lot of knowledge about how to navigate the real estate business in England. We have him coming up with plans to trick people, to take control of a ship, to control different characters with his kind of evil eye capability, his persuasive capabilities. We have him coming up with plans to attack the heroes of the book, but he usually does so by proxy, either by some kind of minion, or by setting up some kind of a trap, or by creating confusion so that they go off in the wrong direction and waste a bunch of their time while he's completing his own plans. He leaves enough mystery and enough distance that they can never confront him directly, or they have a hard time doing so. And so they can't, for instance, call upon their local authorities. They can't call the police because, all they have evidence-wise is that, there were some dogs outside just last night, kind of thing. Or this person is acting strange and she's anemic. He leaves very little trace. He keeps enough distance that he leaves very little trace to actually reach back to him, which makes it harder for the characters to find him, and makes it more terrifying for the reader in the sense that it's like, is he approaching now? Is he far away? Is he hiding? Is he retreating? Are we on the right trail? If your target is far away and is trying to evade you, then you don't necessarily even know if you're on the right trail, and if you might be walking into a trap. There's all kinds of kind of horror notions that you can kind of think up in your own mind based on the way that Dracula maintains distance. Now, Phantom is also does this really, really well. Phantom the Opera, because the trick with the Phantom is that he's often closer than you think, right? And that could be a very terrifying notion, that this malevolent force, you think it's like you feel perfectly alone in this room, but there might be a trapdoor right there, and he might be right behind it, waiting for you to lower your guard. And this kind of closer than you think notion would be a lot scarier at a slower pace too. I'll note that sense of the unknown, of the nebulous danger is something that I think can be made to work really, really well from a horror perspective. Whereas if there's always this kind of frantic, use of trapdoors over and over and over again, and people are running around like crazy, you kind of end up almost in a semi-comical notion, kind of like a Scooby-Doo cartoon, right? Like the chase scenes where they're running from door to door. There's no horror there because everything's happening so quickly that, well, if you're going to get caught, if a character is going to get caught unawares, then it's just going to happen. As opposed to having to kind of creep through a dark hallway, not knowing whether you're walking right into a trap kind of thing. And, that kind of sense of fear and doubt are things that you want to build up in horror. And distance, because it's not just like the distance itself, but it's also kind of like the uncertainty in distance that can help to contribute to that sense of horror, of dread, of terror. And another thing that the Phantom uses that I'm kind of classifying as distance is his use of like masks or proxies, right? Dracula uses proxies in order to keep Dracula himself at a greater distance from the dangers to him while still projecting danger onto the protagonists. The Phantom does this in various ways by kind of wearing different masks, making it unsure whether there's more than one culprit, for instance. There's a series of questioning parts early in the book where it's like, well, are there people who are working with the Phantom? Are there people who are helping him achieve his goals while kind of pretending to be opposed to him? And there's a lot of like, well, is this person helping him out? Is this person helping him out? Is this person lying about how they were getting money to him kind of thing? And again, that's kind of an issue where, if you are aware of one culprit and you are aware that other culprit is, and you're aware that he's far away, you feel kind of safe. But if you're not sure how many culprits there are, if there might be someone, ready to stab you in the back right behind you, then that can add to the horror of a narrative as well. So, finally, and this is kind of the last element, and I'm calling it malevolence, which is maybe too simplistic a term or something like that, but of course, part of, horror in general is that this force that you're trying to fight against is actually a malevolent force and shows you that it is a malevolent force, right? If there's it's the difference between like a wolf that's just hungry, right? And you could appease it versus a wolf that, has a taste for human flesh kind of thing. It's like, there's that book and movie, what is it called? Ghost in the Darkness, I think, right? It's about my understanding is that it's about a lion that kind of develops a taste for human flesh. And, it's not just that they can throw it a steak and it'll go away. It's that even if they throw it a steak, it might decide, oh, well, I'd rather have you, right? And so that kind of malevolence is a great element of horror, of any kind of, high tension horror writing where you want the reader to, if not fear for themselves, at least fear for the protagonists. So, the obvious answer is that Dracula is a supernatural dread force. Well, that's clearly malevolent. His malevolence stems from his total lack of care for his victims, right? He believes that his victims are inferior beings, and he even has some kind of a little bit of a justification for that, right? Like, he has powers of regeneration, he has some weaknesses, but like, if compare you to you who can also turn into mist and control wolves, you'd consider the one with the magic powers to be a little bit superior, right? And so he's almost kind of justified in a way, which feeds back into his like lack of care for the lives of his victims. Clearly Dracula is a malevolent force. We're not going to spend too much time on that. Let's actually talk a little bit more about the Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom of the Opera is a madman who is not just mad, but also enamored with a particular person, right? And so the malevolence comes from people basically getting in the way of his attempt to romance this woman. That gives him not just a strong amount of malevolence that can be used to build horror, but it also gives him a strong motivation, and it gives the protagonist characters a reason to believe that they may be like provoking him, if that makes sense. Dracula doesn't need any provocation. The Phantom of the Opera is harmless until you start to get in his way. but at the same time, the characters are drawn through the narrative into having goals that require them to get in his way. And that is what helps to generate the horror and the malevolence of the Phantom of the Opera. To be fair, having some... You can do this right and you can do this wrong, but like having more human moments for the Phantom might make his mad moments scarier and more interesting. On the other hand, they could temper his malevolence in such a way that he's no longer as horrifying a force as he is in the book. You have to be very careful when dealing with humanizing the malevolent, because there's a big difference between Dracula and what's that series called, the Sparkly Vampire series. I forget what it's called, but right, one of Dracula is malevolent. The Sparkly Vampire has the potential to be malevolent, but the story's not about him being malevolent. It's about humanizing him in a way. And so by doing so, by humanizing this, what should be a supernatural dread force, they're removing the horror element. But by the same token, if they had humanized him in a way that made his malevolence more targeted, made it more understandable, made it more relatable, then they could have made a malevolent force that had human elements, and those human elements made it scarier, if that makes sense. I mean, like to list things that a more human malevolent force would go for, right? More mind games, more tough choices for the protagonists, more unpredictability from his madness, more threats, right? Dracula never really bothers threatening anyone directly. He's just like, yeah, I'm going to send wolves to your house and they're going to kill you probably. And then I'm going to continue to suck the blood of this person until they die, and then they're going to become a force against you as well. Stuff like that. A human horror, a human horror will threaten you. They will offer you an out. Do this and I won't hurt you, kind of thing. And the way that they perceive your reaction to that threat can make them all the more horrifying. It's like the difference between like a rational burglar, right? And like just some kind of like sadistic serial killer. You can create a lot of really strong horror from a very human character because of how they judge, but because of how they value things and how they devalue the lives of the protagonists or their victims in whatever sense. By having more consequences, you can have more malevolence, right? Just to give kind of a hypothetical example, if by fighting back Dracula's wolves, what actually happened is that those wolves went and destroyed a farm or something somewhere and killed some innocent people, then what would happen, for instance, is that the characters would be like, well, not only do we have to fend off these dangers coming from Dracula, but we also have to do so in a way that doesn't bring other people, innocent people, into the scope of this dangerous situation. It's the difference between a serial killer and a serial killer that uses your own family as hostages, kind of thing. And another thing that Phantom, I think, should have done more of to add to his malevolence was action at a distance. Trapdoors mean that you kind of control things from far away. And if the Phantom had spent more time kind of using trapdoors or various mechanisms to kind of like lead the characters into false areas, into dangerous spots, into confusing situations, I think it would have made him a little bit more malevolent. We can see that both of these books do a good job in different ways of making their characters malevolent, but both of them could have used some improvements, for instance. Just from my hypothetical about Dracula, and then talking about having the Phantom do a little bit more action at distance. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this, so let's call it here. I don't know. 4 elements of horror: pacing, demonstration, distance, and malevolence. Maybe you have some other ideas. Maybe you have some other elements of horror that you think are worth talking about. Feel free to leave comments talking about that kind of stuff. Love to hear it. But But these are just kind of like a couple of things that I thought about looking at both these books. If you want to see a full review of Dracula or Phantom of the Opera, those links will be in the description. And yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing on this channel, you know what to do. Otherwise, I will see you next time, probably for a review of Doomsday Recon. I just finished reading it yesterday. I'm still putting my thoughts together about it and kind of going back over it a little bit. But I should have a review up for that in a couple of days. So with that, I'll say thanks again and see you later.